And here we go. Hello, I'm Michael Moranzada. I'm the Commodore of the Pacific Cup Yacht Club. With me, virtually anyway, is Seadon Wijsen. And Seadon, I always mispronounce your last name. I apologize. And given that mine's weird, I should have been more careful. Could you give us the correct pronunciation?
Yeah, you're close. It's Wijsen.
Wijsen. Oh, the J has no role whatsoever.
Exactly.
Great. Okay. Seadon has been with North Sails for quite a while. He is well known on the bay as an expert tactician. We have him here today to talk about sales using his expertise with the North line of products and sales generally. Really, this isn't a sales pitch. It's general advice for the Pacific Cup or really whatever coastal or ocean crossing race you might be engaging in. Seadon, how many times have you gone across the Pacific?
Racing 8 times, all total 10 times.
Okay. My number ends in a half because we lost a forestay on one return trip. So things can be different, but so you've done it a lot, and what we're going to do is we're going to do sort of a general question and answer. Seadon and I agreed on an order of topics. I'll cue him up and he'll knock them down. He's provided me with a set of slides that we will put up as appropriate. So if there's no further ado, and not that we've given you any opportunities to ado, the general structure, and I'll just outline this. The general structure is we want to talk about the 4 parts of the race, and Stan Honey brings those up. And he's sort of given them the names that have stuck. First, there's the beat, that first couple of hours to get out to generally the synoptic wind, to get out where you're going to start to make your turn. And that's less than a day. That's hopefully a couple hours. It has been longer in light years. I remember in the year 2000, we spent 24 hours bobbing around the Farallones. A lot of people remember that as a terrible year. Then you turn and you have what Stan calls the windy reach. Tough weather, cold, strong breeze, opportunities for huge gains on the competition if you've got the right sail plan, as happened to us one year. At some point, and here's where we get into the tactics, you turn, you ease the sheets, you put up your downwind configuration, and Stan Honey calls that the slot cars because it's a bad idea to try to change course dramatically.
Right.
And I've done that. And then finally, of course, the finish. And so what we want to get from Seadon is sort of, for each of those chunks of the race and for the various kinds of boats we're going to see, what kind of sail do you want to think about carrying? So with that said, Seadon, do you want to introduce any more material about those chunks of the race or about yourself?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll talk about each part of the race and the sails that you'll need for those part of each of the race. But if you have any specific questions to each part, go ahead and fire away.
Okay. Well, why don't we start with the with that first chunk of the race, the beat.
Yeah.
I'll just throw in there's a big psychological advantage to being the first one to the Golden Gate Bridge. It makes no difference, but it does seem to intimidate your competition. But once you're out there, Seadon, let's start with the middle-sized boats, say a Passport 40, a Cal 40, J35. What are you going to be looking at for your sail plan for that chunk of the race?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to do, typically, these starts will be in the early mid-afternoon, later afternoon as the days and the fleets progress, which is typically pretty breezy. Typically, and I haven't looked at the tides, but I'm assuming we start in some sort of an ebb tide.
Yes.
Every time I've done this, it's been in an ebb tide. So you get pushed out the gate pretty quick. So often it's a start on starboard, tack over to port pretty quickly, get out to the ebb, and get pushed out under the gate. So the first key is really looking to see what the wind is doing outside the bridge. So what I'll do is look at the buoy reports for the lightship and just see if we have 20 to 25 knots at the start, how much wind is going to be just outside of Bonita, and does that warrant a sail change? And if it does, then do you try to, depending on the type of boat you have and your sails and so on, does it warrant keeping the same, starting with the sail and keeping that same sail up, or are you going to have to do a change? And what does your long-term forecast look like? Because a lot of times you may be starting with the number 3, but you won't need that number 3 jib for the rest of the race. And so can you leave that number 3 on the dock? Can you leave that at home and hang it out with a number 1 for the first 20 minutes or so, and then watch the breeze lighten up? Now, your long range forecast plays into this in a lot of aspects. If it looks like it's going to be breezy, maybe a few hundred miles off the shore, then you're going to want some sort of a heavy head sail anyways. So then you may be starting with that sail, shifting to your lighter sail, and then shifting back to that sail. But if you don't see any real breeze in the long range, you may just try to hang on with the number 1, get out to the lighter air, and then start your race there.
Why don't I put up your slide, I think, for close reaching? Would that be appropriate?
You don't have to get to that quite yet.
Okay, I'll wait.
Yep.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Now, so a couple of things in there to unpack for those that haven't done a lot of departure under the gate. The wind typically goes significantly lighter once you're out somewhat past there, and so that's really good advice about being ready to switch to the number 1 or possibly start with it. Can you talk about what you think about the trade-off on leaving that number 3 at home? Is it just the weight?
Yeah, I mean, the goal with your sail inventory for this race is to carry as few sails as possible, but to cover all the wind ranges that you're going to encounter. And number 3 is really sort of a specific sail for upwind. And we'll talk about, reaching sails in the blast reacher later. You could carry a heavy weather jib. The rules require to take 2 out of the 3 storm sails, which include a heavy weather jib. That heavy weather jib for a lot of boats may work for that first part of the beat out of the bridge if it's the standard windy condition. So the fewer head sails that you can take on the race, the better. 1 for weight, 2 for just room, and then you may also figure your budget, your sail inventory budget, and realize that a new number 3 is not something that's going to be of much value for this race, and you put that money towards something else that will be of more value for the race.
Like Pacific Cup shirts, for example.
There you go.
So I asked you about the mid-range boat. Does this advice change significantly for a light double-hander or a sled?
Yeah, I mean, I would think if you're in a light boat, tender boat, so say a double-handed Express 27 or so, sort of an optimum inventory would have some sort of a reaching head sail like a blast reacher, which could be your heavy weather jib, which could be the sail that you start with. Again, in a good ebb, you may only be in the sail for about 20 minutes or so, maybe half hour, and then you may be switching to your lighter air upwind sail, like your number 1 general or a jib top or some sort of a reaching sail. So again, like on an Express 27, number 3 is not that important to have, and you could use your heavy weather jib in that place.
And the trade-off might be you made, fair disclosure, Seadon has made some very nice sails for me. The trade-off might be, depending on the sail you're using in the place of the number 3, you might be giving up a little bit of drive, you might be giving up a little bit of pointing. And so you sort of need to trade that off and understand how much you're giving away. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, exactly. And again, as you mentioned, it's psychologically, it's nice to be first out the gate and lead. A lot of times that's just the person who's going to show you where the hole is and, watch everyone else go around that person. But it's a very small part of the race, and to carry, a head sail that you're only going to use for a short while doesn't make a lot of sense. So obviously you have to go upwind. There will be some tacking involved, and you need to be able to not fall too far behind, because the race is really to get out to that, synoptic wind before the breeze shuts off in the evening. And so you don't want to waste too much time getting out. But again, if you can eliminate a sail that you're really not going to use for more than a half an hour, then I recommend you leave that sail in the dock.
Okay. So one of the things that you've been touching on pretty heavily, and we'll come back to this several times, I think, is combining the functions of a sail. And you talked about maybe your heavy weather serves as that beating sail. Maybe it's your blast reacher that you use to get upwind. And I think that's something that, a good sailmaker, a good planner, a good strategist for the race is going to be looking at, is like, which of these sails can we get rid of? If we're ordering a new sail, how can we have one sail do the job of two? That's something that is a nice thing to have. So let's say we're out there, we have gotten the synoptic wind, the sun is setting, but we've got enough wind to keep the boat going. We've eaten our semi-warm beef stew to get going, and we're on the windy reach. For some boats, that's a couple of days. For some boats, it's 3, possibly 4. What do you think? Let's again start with that mid-sized boat.
Okay, so again, the last little part of your beat out to that synoptic wind, as the wind typically will transition to lighter and you're going past the farallons and so on, it's pretty important to make your sail change quick as soon as the boat becomes underpowered, to get out to that wind as quickly as possible. Once you sort of approach that, you get into those conditions, then you typically can be in that. You can see it increase through the night into the next day, or a lot of times it could just stay sort of moderate with a very slow build, or even potentially die off. I think the key is once you're into it, is to optimize your sheet lead positions, your trim. Obviously you want to have the right sail, whether it's a jib top, high clue Genoa, a code 0. Sometimes, but not often, you may even be into a spinnaker. That's fairly rare. So the most typical sail would be some sort of a jib top, or a code 0. And if it gets really breezy, then you would be into a high clued head sail, non-overlapping head sail known as a blast reacher. And that sail, as we mentioned, could be your heavy weather jib or your number 4 jib.
Let's talk for a minute, particularly for those that maybe have not done this before, about the difference between a jib top and a blast reacher, both in terms of structure and size, and when you might choose one over the other. Yeah.
Okay. So a jib top is often the size of your largest head sail. So, again, say this Cal 40, and say you have 155% Genoa, a jib top would be a high clued 155% head sail. And the higher the clue, would be designed more draft forward to keep that slot open between the main and the head sail, so that you can let the main out a little bit further. The boat will accelerate, go, and just sail more balanced and faster. A blast reacher is a heavy air reaching head sail. So it also has a high clue for, optimum outboard lead sheeting. And again, draft forward, open the slot up between the main and the head sail. And it's typically around a 90 to 105% head sail. It's a sail that's often, when a lot of boats will take an older head sail and recut it. It's depending on what your old head sail inventory, it can be done. Or sometimes it's best to make a sail that qualifies as a heavy weather jib, has a high clue, and it's a perfect crossover sail between a blast reacher and a heavy weather jib.
One of the pieces of advice I picked up early on too was another advantage of that high clue is when you take a bunch of heavy water over the bow, it doesn't rip the bottom of your sail out.
Yeah, that's the thought. I've never seen that ever happen with a low clued sail, but just a high clued sail is much more optimum for an outboard lead.
Yeah.
The higher the clue, the better the reaching sail is going to be, the better it's going to sheet out to the rail. And if you just sort of imagine, if you took your number 3 and you went to the rail and you just ease the sheet a little bit, you lose the top of the sail. It just twists quite a bit. And having the higher clue eliminates a lot of that twist, retain the power. The other note for a lot of the cruising people are going to cruise their boats or deliver their boats back. A nice high clue jib, which we would consider a blast reacher, makes an excellent cruising sail. You're not going to point quite as high as with a standard head sail, but when you're cruising, often you're cracked off the wind, and it makes for a really nice close reaching or slightly upwind sail.
I've noticed in many cases that a roller furling sail might happen to just have a similar structure, and that certainly is what I've encountered several times back when I was racing the Passport 40.
Yeah. Actually, I think on one of the slides, Michael, is I have some design of blast reacher and a photo. If you are able to pull that up, then we can.
Well, let's see if I can.
Yeah. So there you can go. There you can see kind of what a blast reacher looks like. In the images there, the purple sail, and I'm not sure how well everyone can see that, but the purple sail is what would be a typical number 3 jib on this rig. And the blast reacher is the green sail. So you can see it's tacked to the same point. It's a little bit smaller than 100% number 3 jib. Clue's a little bit higher, a little more hollow in the leech. And really the goal is to keep that slot open between the main and the jib for just optimum close reaching. I got a photo there of a high clue jib, which is kind of the size of a blast reacher. And this is a very effective setup for almost all boats. When you get out into that synoptic wind, where you can encounter a lot of 25 to 35, you have this sail on a reef, and the boat is very well balanced.
I can tell folks from experience that, really having the setup for this particular leg of the race dialed in is a really nice thing to have, and having a sail that will not make your boat wallow, that will let you maintain your course without horsing the rudder around a lot, is a real blessing. You may find, as has happened to us, that actually reefing your main, if the wind is heavy, is an important thing to do to maintain the boat balance, but you're still just bombing along with the right head sail. So, and Seadon, I think you'd probably also agree, knowing where your leads go before you go out is a pretty important move.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the points I want to touch on is outboard leads are very critical in this race for every type of boat. Most every race boat is optimized their outboard leads. If that's something that your boat doesn't have yet, and you want to really explore where those leads should go and test your angles, set a couple of leads if you have the ability to kind of put them temporary, and then sheet the sail to those leads, see if it works, make sure the top isn't twisting off too far. Typically, if you take your lead from your head sail and you make an arc out to the rail, then the location should be very close. I have a slide. If you go down 2 more, I think, Michael, there's some pictures of outboard leads. They can be simple because the sheet is not often trimmed in and out. But in the first picture, you'll see a black ferrule, and again, that's just a very simple lead. You run a line to that straight to the jib clue, and again, you're not trimming the sail in and out, so there's not a lot of friction. So putting a fitting on there is just fine. On the picture on the right, there's a couple of outboard leads for different size head sails. You can see this boat has a number 3 tracks in front of the shroud, and essentially the number 3 would sheet outboard to the pad eye that's aft in the picture, and the number 4 head sail would sheet to the pad eye that's forward in that picture. But essentially a pad eye with a block or a fair lead is all you really need. You just need to make sure it's in the right location. Again, this is part of your overall prep before you start the race.
So a couple of things on this. Of course, the lifelines have just been temporarily removed for the photograph. Uh, I'm sure that's a regularly equipped boat. The other thing is, and I've learned this the hard way, you know, if you're adding these leads, if you're adding any of these things, particularly that relate to your running rigging, keep an eye on whether you're creating a significant chafe point either on the line or on the sail itself, and keep an eye on whether you're adding a ton of strain to something that really isn't designed to take it, or isn't designed to take it in that direction. You can blow a block right off your deck if you're pulling it wrong in a way that it hasn't been set up for. So talking about the sails for the Windy Reach, I'm gonna just go out on a limb and say it's pretty much the same story for a mid-sized boat and a smaller or short-handed boat. But what about the lighter, faster boats? Do they face a significantly enough different apparent wind that this advice doesn't apply so much, or are we all looking at the same thing?
Yeah, no, this applies to every boat in the race, whether it's a heavy cruising boat or a light tender boat or, you know, a true race boat. I mean, this part of the race to me is the most critical. The early reach, and then the slot, Stan Honey's slot cars part of the race, because this is where you can really make distance on your competitors. Or if you have a boat that doesn't reach well and you really optimize it to reaching, at least you can kind of hang on. And then typically a boat that doesn't reach well can be pretty quick downwind. You know, for example, like in Express 27 and Olsen 30, OB 33, boats like that, they don't have a lot of stability, typically would be double-handed. You know, they really want to optimize their setups, their sails, their lead positions, all that for this reach, and try to hang on, try not to lose too much distance to the heavier, longer waterline, stiffer boats. And then if they're in good position, then those boats will really make their gains downwind. So again, the reaching portion of the race is to me the most important part of the race. And this is where all your prep, all your homework really should go into before you even start the race. You know, optimize your sails, optimize your sheeting and lead positions, optimize your boat setup for this part of the race.
We have a question from Peter Frey, who asks, is the Windy Reach typically 25 to 35 knots?
Yeah, you know, I've done the race a number of times and I've seen everything. And so, and a lot of times when we call these things the Windy Reach, they become overgeneralized because that's what people remember from when they did the race. I would say the Windy Reach is more common, but I've done the race where we've been up 500 miles out and we've been going upwind. So I would say the 25 to 35 is more common than the 10 to 15, but you want to be prepared for that 10 to 15, 10 to 20 as well. And we can talk about some of the other reaching sails for this
Okay.
topic as well, if you want.
I would add another point too, as we talk about being, you know, have your plan ready, have your sheet leads figured out. Half your crew is going to be barfing, and the rest of you are not going to feel like being creative. So having a plan and executing on it for that reach is really important. I've seen people just shut down and be unhelpful and entirely during that time frame, and it can slow you down. But it's a fun race. And if we don't have questions on the Windy Reach, the next section, okay, is, well, there's sort of two things that happen. One is the big decision and necessarily the long crew discussion about when do you turn to start to go downwind. And then now you're in the slot cars, you're in the multi-100,000 miles of wonderful downwind sailing. So you're going to need a bunch of sails for that. So do you want to talk real briefly about when to turn, because we're going to hit that in some detail in a later discussion. But then once you've turned, what do you do?
Okay. Well, so we can back up a little bit and
Oh,
talk again. If it's not a windy reach, and to where you get to that slot car portion of the race, it's you're not turning; it's the wind turning for you, and you just get lifted and lifted, right? So you go from head sail or reaching sail or code zero type of sail to all of a sudden getting lifted, and sometimes that lift is gradual and take an entire day or so, and sometimes it can come pretty darn quick. And what's real important, and I have a slide of a sail chart.
oh yeah, that's super important. I'm glad you brought that
Yeah,
up.
we
Let me
can put that up
pull
and
that
kind of
up
go over
there.
that. So, what's real important, again, I was talking a little bit about how to optimize, making sure your boat is optimized for the reaching. It's really important to know what all your, one, to carry sails that cover all the ranges, right? That's rule number one. And two, to really know the outer edges of every sail that you have. So this is a sail chart for a Santa Cruz 50. And
Hey, I've got one of those.
yeah, this is a fairly basic one, but if you look at a lot of sail charts, there are curves, a lot of curves, a lot of, based on the polars of the boat and so on. And they're a little more detailed, but I find them very difficult to read. And the goal of the sail chart is to have this up on the bulkhead in the cockpit to make your sail decisions no-brainers. The idea is that it's 2 a.m. and everyone's tired and you're just not sure if you're in the right sail or not. You can just refer to a chart like this and know if you're into that sail or not, or if you're borderline and need to know, how much more of a lift you need to change to another sail. So again, this is a fairly basic inventory. Head sails, reaching sails, code zero, and then the full gamut of spinnakers, A1, A2, A3, A4, and then listed the 1.5 ounce, which is basically your heavy air spinnaker on this chart. So I would encourage everyone doing the race to develop something like this. And this is something that your sailmaker can help you with, but it's also really comes down to the crews on each boat to go out and practice, put each sail up, know how high you can sail with each sail, know how low you can sail until the boat starts to become underpowered or becomes to wallow and needs more power. And take those notes down, take out a notepad, write it down, write the wind conditions, write your true wind or parent wind angles down, and then you can formulate your own sail chart. Every boat's a little bit different and every condition is a little bit different. You're going to change over differently in flat water or small swells versus big swells. Is it a solid 18 knots of wind or is it just sort of a soft 18 knots of wind? So the edges are a little blurred, but the better you know your inventory and the better your inventory covers all these ranges, the better off you're going to be. So it's kind of a good time to bring this up because when you get into that slot car, you go from the reach to the slot cars, you're going to get lifted and you're going to go from your reaching head sail to a reaching spinnaker pretty quick. And then, potentially even a more powerful spinnaker as a A2 or a, lighter symmetric spinnaker. So
the underlying point here is not too dissimilar from the one I was making about setting up your leads. It's really powerful to have a plan in advance and to have the crew aware of it because, the skipper, the navigator, the tactician, they're all going to be asleep from time to time. And you really need a crew that is that's bought into the scheme and that is ready to execute it, even if it means waking everybody up to make that sail change.
Yeah, I think one important point is, whoever is sort of the leader of the team that's up, if they're unsure, but they have sort of a feeling that the change is coming or change is needed, they can do a lot to prepare and then wake up the navigator or, the tactician, whoever's in charge. But, in the dark, if you haven't put a spinnaker up yet, you're running sheets, you're making sure everything's clear of everything else that's on the deck. And, that can take a good 15, 20 minutes, sometimes longer. And that's, 15, 20 plus minutes that you don't want to sail on the wrong sail, ideally. So knowing when you might have a potential change, getting prepared for it, and then making the final decision either by waking up the tactician or navigator or making a decision with the crew that's up on deck.
Okay, so I think we're still on the topic of the slot cars, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So I was going to roll into the reaching sails. Did you have a question? I thought I saw one pop up on the screen, but
No, I think that's the one we answered.
Okay.
Let me take a look here. No, that's still Peter Frey's question that you addressed.
I see another one.
Do you? What is it? Go ahead and answer it.
From Rod Donneville. Are these slides available? Yes, I can make these available for sure. Okay. So we're still reaching here. So, we didn't talk much about the light air reaching. So if you want to go to, I think the slide above the blast reacher, keep going up.
Wing on wing. I've done that. That's not fast.
We'll get there.
What are we looking for?
Keep going.
Okay.
Yeah, actually the top
Oh, the
slide.
one above the blast reacher,
Yeah.
sorry.
There we go. So we're a little close reaching sails. So if it's not the windy reach, you could be in a code 0 or a jib top. We talked a little bit about that already. Here's a couple of photos of code 0s on modern sprit boats. Code 0s make the most sense on boats with sprits or, fractionally rigged boats. Masthead rigged boats with Genoas, it doesn't make as much sense, but every boat is a little bit different. And, if you have a masthead boat and you're only carrying a non-overlapping jib, a small jib, then a code 0 could make a lot of sense. But these are typically the sails that you would carry in that portion of the race and into the slot cars. Would be code 0 or jib top into an A3 spinnaker or some sort of a reaching spinnaker. It's critical that every boat has a reaching spinnaker if you're going to compete in this race. And that reaching spinnaker can double as, your heavy air spinnaker. So smaller boats, Express 27 or, something along those lines that may only carry a couple of spinnakers, you can make your reaching spinnaker your heavy air spinnaker as well. So again, you want fewer sails that can cover more ranges is what you're looking for.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions here.
Okay.
Let's see, do you recommend I create a sail chart with my crew or with the sailmaker? Oh, you missed that one. And I think the answer is start with your sailmaker, but validate it with your crew.
Exactly.
Mimo asks, why is it called slot car? Well, can I answer that one? Because I know the answer to that one.
Yeah.
So basically, because the wind is blowing roughly toward Hawaii, you want to go that direction. And if you decide you need to jibe to significantly change your north-south position on the way to Hawaii, well, that's a very expensive and generally tactically poor decision unless you really, really have to. The net result is, once you've chosen where you're going to start your run to Hawaii in, you pretty much are committed to that as if you were a slot car in a slot. At least that's the way it's been explained to me.
Yeah, that's the way I understand it.
I would point out, and just as an aside here, you've given a great description not only of how to have a good first several days of the Pac Cup, but also how to win California Offshore Race Week.
Yeah, the thing that's great about the California Race Week, the Spinnaker Cup, Coastal Cup, and so on, is that they're like miniature Pacific Cups. I always think the Spinnaker Cup is like a very short version of the Pacific Cup in the sense that you beat out the bridge, you're close reaching, over Ocean Beach, Montara, and then you get off Half Moon Bay and you typically get lifted and you're into a reaching spinnaker, an A3. And then, before you get to Año Nuevo, you typically get lifted and you're full running, all the way down to Monterey. And so the Spinnaker Cup is a perfect time to have all these sails and to try them all out.
It's also a good time to try your sails out under significant wind conditions and not just see how they look in 5 knots of wind, which is what I did one year and learned a few things once the wind came up. But we'll leave that to go. Okay, so do you want to talk at all about the tweener sail, which not everybody may be familiar with?
Yeah, I kind of put that in there just because most people wouldn't know what that is, most likely. And most boats won't carry that. That's a sail that's more typical of the boats racing in the ORR, the bigger boats. It certainly can be an effective sail for smaller boats, though. And essentially what that is that a Code Zero is considered a spinnaker, the way it's measured. It has a mid-girth of 75% of the foot or larger, and to be a spinnaker. And so that typically a Code Zero will have a mid-girth right at 75%, but ideally to be a better reaching sail, it would have a smaller mid-girth, something along the lines of 55 to 65% of the foot. So those sails were not legal before. Code Zeros being a spinnaker are legal, and your head sail, which would have a smaller mid-girth, would be legal. But these sails that we refer to as tweeners, because it's in between the two mid-girth rules, were sails that no one carried because they're not legal per the rules. Now ORR has allowed them, and they're becoming more common, especially on these more modern boats where they carry the apparent wind so far forward. And essentially by having a smaller mid-girth, you can make a sail that's basically more like a Genoa. And for the more modern boats that typically have non-overlapping head sails, head sails that are around 105%, that sheet in front of the spreaders inside the shrouds, they don't have a Genoa. So their Genoa is a Code Zero, but to get a real effective upwind Code Zero, we were building what we consider a tweener. Sails with 55 to 65% mid-girths, and they're essentially like a loose luff Genoa.
Yeah, so I got one of those before Cal Offshore, and if it's designed right for your boat, it can do wonders. They're legal under PHRF now too. You do under either rule, you face a bit of a rating hit, but it's worth looking at.
Yeah.
We don't want to get too far off on this, but Rod asked a question. I'm considering a carbon 6-foot sprit. Do you think this is advisable? Is that within the scope of our discussion today?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that briefly. Do we know what type of boat?
Rod, you want to come back with what type of boat, and we'll go on for a few more topics with that. Because yeah, a 6-foot sprit on a 60-foot boat is a real different story from a 6-foot. It's a Swan 44 Mark II. Okay.
Well, if you put a sprit on your boat, you're going to take a penalty under PHRF, which the race is under. And the question is, how much do you increase your performance versus how much of a rating penalty do you take? Now, Swan 44 is going to be a boat that wants to sail dead downwind once you get in those conditions. Mm-hmm. So if you're considering, I would definitely consider or recommend having, your spinnakers on a standard pole that you can articulate back. If the question is to have a sprit that includes having an articulating pole, then that's probably something to look closer at, what type of sails you tack off of it and what kind of a rating penalty you would take. So, I can get more in depth on the topic, but probably a little off topic for most everyone else. But it's something certainly worth considering, but you have to really take a look at what kind of penalty you'll get and see if it's really going to improve the reaching performance of the boat.
Yeah, I think that's really sound advice there. With all of these things, you need to think about the way your boat's going to be sailing and the expected wind. And it won't be too many days before you're going to really want to be squared back. So you're quite right. I'm sure, Seadon, that the sprint won't do you nearly as much benefit as your pole. I went with extending my pole 2 feet, and I took a rating hit for it, but it paid off nicely. That's something you might want to talk to a marine architect and or your sailmaker about.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're in the windy reach. I'm sorry.
We're in the slot cars.
We're in the slot cars. That's right. Yeah, I'm not even drinking. So we're in the slot cars.
Yeah.
How many spinnakers should a boat be carrying for that leg?
Yeah. Well, it depends a lot on the size boat that you have and the type of boat that you have. I mean, for sure, we already talked about you need some sort of a reaching spinnaker as you're going into the slot cars. That's typically going to be an asymmetric, and that would typically be coded as an A3, which is a reaching spinnaker. If you're a cruising boat, it would be some sort of a Gennaker is what I would recommend. Again, for smaller boats, that reaching spinnaker can again be made from heavier fabric because typically you're sailing higher angles, your apparent wind is forward and stronger, and typically as part of the race can be breezier. So again, for smaller mid-sized boats, make your reaching spinnaker your heavy air spinnaker. As you're going to the downwind portion of the race, and you're using, a variety of different spinnakers, typically the race is going to be between 10 and 18 knots, which is going to be a ½ ounce, 3/4 ounce asymmetric or symmetric spinnaker. And that's a sail you're probably going to use about 80% of the time in this portion of the race. And so you definitely want to have that sail. You're definitely going to want some sort of a backup to that sail. And then you're going to want something probably stronger for heavier air running in case it is more 20 to 25 knots of running and for squalls.
So you call that the shy kite?
It could be what we would call an A4 or an S4, which would be a full size, just a stronger version of your A2, basically a little more running oriented in the design, but just a stronger sail, something that you can get through the squalls with, something that you might put up at night because you feel a little more comfortable with it if it does get windy, something that in most boats you'd use once you kind of hit 18, 20 knots. Shy kite would be more the A3 or whatever you're using as your reaching spinnaker. We'd call that more like a A5 or an S5.
Okay. I want to put a pin in one point, which is, let's bring it up now. Some folks, particularly folks who may not have done this crossing before or don't have a crew that has got quite the development that they'll have by the end of the race, they may be uncomfortable with the spinnakers up at night. What do you think? Besides, get over it. I mean, that's not good advice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's sort of a good segue into the old wing and wing photo that I kind of
let's pull it up
there last second. The heavier the boat you have, the less likely you increase speed when you're reaching up. Your best VMG is going straight to what we'd say straight to the mark or straight to the finish line in Hawaii. And so if you're in a heavy boat and there's enough wind and you can sail lower by going wing on wing, then that's something that you would certainly want to consider. And kind of, again, like reaching sails, optimize your setup for this, find the right head sail to go wing on wing with. So for those that would be not comfortable putting a spinnaker up at night and wanting to take it down, then the wing on wing option is good. this is a picture of a FAR 40 in the Coastal Cup in about 35 to 40 knots. They've got a reef in the main and a number 4 on a pole, and they're sailing, you know, fully in control and quite successfully surfing down the waves pretty aggressively in that much wind. I think this is a setup that a lot of the shorthanders should carry regardless of the type of the boat that they have, because it's just much easier to steer the boat in this configuration. You conserve a lot of energy. It's much easier for an autopilot to steer the boat in this configuration. And again, maybe what you might lose on a higher performance boat in terms of speed, you might gain in VMG. And again, these are things to play with. And the people that are doing the race that know their boats well will know when the crossover is to say, hey, you know, it's too out of control to spinnaker. We're not going to lose much if we go wing on wing. And if anything, we potentially will gain by not breaking things and not being so exhausted. So this is you know, again, this is a FAR 40 is using a spinnaker pole. So you can use your spinnaker pole for this configuration, and some of the heavier cruising boats most likely have whisker poles that they can use for this. So
you can use, we also allow you to use 2 head sails at once. But I will tell you from experience, you better practice that first because it gets kind of wacky. And there's some rules about what size pole you can use. You know, and yeah, doing this can be effective. We certainly have done it. If you're doing it entirely out of concern because you're new at this, you will be giving up some speed. On the other hand, I recall in either the 2000 or the 2002 race, I got scared and I said, it was 2002. And I said, I got scared one night and I said, guys, we're going to go, we're taking down the spinnakers. We're going to go wing and wing. And I got a lot of grumbling from the crew, but we did it. And I was pretty smug the next morning when we hadn't really lost any mileage at all, but we listened to Pyewacket tell us how they spent 5 hours up the mast cutting down their spinnaker that had wrapped. So we felt pretty clever for that. There's a question, Seadon, from Jesse Barham, who asks if there's any advantage in carrying both asymmetrical and symmetrical spins, or should we pick one? In this case, it's for a masthead boat.
Okay. Well, there's no penalty in carrying symmetrics, asymmetrics, you know, granted that they are measuring to the same size. An asymmetric is generally the more efficient sail. Definitely that's the case for reaching, and often for downwind where you have a lot of swells or confused seas, where you typically will sail a little higher than you would if you're sailing flat water like on San Francisco Bay. So the boats that I have sailed on the last few times, we've carried all asymmetrics, even for deep running, and they just are a little more versatile, a little bit easier, a little more forgiving to trim and to steer to, and they test out to be a little bit faster, you know, straight line VMG. Now, it's funny because I was just having this conversation with Bill Erklands a couple of days ago. Was that yesterday? And he's sailing his Hobie 33, and he brought up the fact that someone had mentioned to him that they carried a symmetric on their Hobie 33 quite successfully. And I think that there is a case where a symmetric can be forgiving when you're sailing in a boat like that, the Santa Cruz 50, a Hobie 33, Olsen 30, those types of boats, where you really get the boat surfing and you can sail way by the lee going down waves. And then you come back up as the boat slows down after the wave, and the sails can be a little more forgiving than an asymmetric in that condition. But overall, everything that we've tested, generally an asymmetric will be faster than a symmetric offshore in the swells.
Okay, so let's see. So we're talking about, you got your A3, which is a reasonably sturdy reaching sail. You've got your A4, which is a heavier runner. You've got your A2, which is your regular runner. Now, maybe a shy kite, you might call it an A5, a heavy, fairly flat cut sail that doesn't have any lift. It just drags you through the water,
Right.
keeps you going. A lot of boats, mine included, carry an A1, a very lightweight, giant ass sail. We don't use it much, as it turns out.
Yeah. Yeah, an A1, we're starting to use what we call now an A15, which is, so an A1 is considered what we consider a Vmg sail. This is a sail that you use when your best VMG to go dead downwind is pull forward and reaching, zigzagging downwind. So this is, for most boats, going to be 0 to 10, maybe 0 to 9 knots, maybe a little bit more wind if it's really lumpy seas. A VMG or an A1 is designed as a flatter, smaller sail because obviously the deeper, bigger sail needs more breeze to keep it lifted in the air and not hanging straight down. If the kite is hanging down, it's either it's too full, too big, or too heavy. And the result is you need to sail a higher angle to get the kite to fill, right? And the whole goal is to sail a lower angle. So a light, flat, smaller kite, and not significantly smaller. And it's a little counterintuitive to have a smaller sail in light air be faster than a bigger sail, but it's actually a more efficient sail. It flies easier in the lighter winds and allows the boat to sail lower, sailing a better VMG dead downwind. So anyways, that's what we would call an A1 or a VMG kite. We're doing a lot of A1.5s, which is sort of a VMG slightly crossed over with a running sail. So it's a little more uprange, a sail you can use as you start to get to that 12, 13 and you start pulling the pole back, it's a little more versatile before you get to your A2. That all being said, it's not often that you get those conditions. You certainly can, and you can certainly get those conditions in the mornings after a squall where you really maybe get 5, 6 knots of breeze and wait for the breeze to slowly fill in. That's where you'd use your A1 or A15. Again, that would fall in that 20% of the downwind sailing, and actually it would be smaller than that because I figure the other 20% you're using your A4, your A5. So I would say, an A1, A15, VMG type spinnaker you're using maybe for 5 to 10% of the race, depending if it's a light air race or not. I mean, I've done one race where we used our A1 actually quite a bit, but that was a real light air race, and we can have those every once in a while.
Your point about needing a bit of body to the sail to have it carry certainly matches my experience. Back on my old Passport 40 Cayenne, before I had light air sails, which made people laugh because they're mean, in some cases the wind would be light and we would actually put up the shy kite to sail with. It was a small kite, it was heavy, but unlike the other kites, it wouldn't flop around. It would actually hold its position and we could move the boat with it. We later got a 1/2 ounce, and that was pretty fun.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the heavy part doesn't help you, but just being a flatter kite, a lot of times it'll be more efficient.
Yeah. Now, what about squalls?
Yeah.
Well, I've heard they have some sometimes. Oddly enough, my last 2 passages, we didn't see any. It was so strange, but I'm sure they'll be back for this race. I guess we're going to give people advice on that. We've got some published on our knowledge base, but on the heavy cruiser that I used to race, we see a squall, we just sort of move out of the way.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I'm guessing the boats you've been racing on, you play with them for a while.
Yeah, I mean, the goal is obviously to get to Hawaii quicker, right? So the more breeze, you're going to get there faster. So you sort of welcome the squalls, but, that being said, I prefer doing races with no squalls. I mean, they just require changes, and if your crew's tired and you're pushing the boat hard and so on, it's you gotta make some changes. You usually have to get guys up and make those changes. So obviously there's a whole thing to think about. How big is the squall? What is our go-to? But just to make some points, if you're in a heavy boat, you typically will get into the squall, you'll get lifted, or if you see the squall coming, you may already jibe over to port pole and just sort of start getting some of it and sailing away from it, not overcomplicate your boat handling. And in that jibe, you may have, before that jibe, you may decide that, okay, we have our 3/4 ounce or ½ ounce spinnaker up now. We know that most likely the squall is going to be, increase in breeze. We're going to go from 18 to 25 or 30 knots. So maybe in that jibe, we'll just keep it simple. We'll take down the spinnaker, or the spinnaker we have up now. Let's jibe over. Let's put our heavy spinnaker up, and let's ride this squall out. And then, when it ends, then we can go back to our light spinnaker. This could also be a time, if you're in a heavy boat, we'll say, okay, let's take the spinnaker down and we'll go wing on wing, and let's just get pushed along with the squall for however long it wants to, stay with us. If you're in a fast boat, something that's, relatively easy to jibe, then you'll typically jibe on the shifts in the squall. You're most likely going to be changing your spinnaker. So as you see them come, you'll have, your crew and your kites ready, and you make the change, and then you jibe back and forth in front of the squall before you exit. And then typically at the squall passes by, the wind gets lighter, and then you go right back into the kite that you were sailing with. This can be exhausting. It could be continual squalls, and you may just decide to stay with your wing and wing or your heavy kite for the night, your A4 or whatever, or you be aggressive and change back and forth.
It also bears mentioning at every opportunity, you want to exit that squall before it passes over you, because behind the squall is a big old patch of zero wind where even that, A1, A2 is not going to get you out of it. And the general advice we give is exit stage left, go out to the left of the squall, because that's the direction you want to go, and otherwise it'll just chase you down.
Yeah, and all that I said, again, if you're in a heavy boat that likes to sail dead downwind, you're not necessarily going to gain a lot with an increase in breeze. I mean, if your boat goes 8-9 knots downwind, stronger breeze, you may go a knot faster or so on, but the gains are probably not significant in comparison to what potentially could go wrong. So a lot of times it's just keeping it simple and jibe away from the squall.
A key corollary to that, and talking about what can go wrong, and I've certainly experienced this. On a light boat, when the wind blows harder, you go faster, okay? A lot faster. On a heavy boat, you don't go much faster at all, just like Seadon said. But what that means, of course, is that you are on a heavy boat, like my old Passport, when the wind builds, it just loads everything up tremendously more. So you've got a much greater risk of injury, you've got a much greater risk of damage, so you really do need to manage that situation. With a light boat or an Express 27, my Santa Cruz 50, the wind blows, you speed up, the loads don't increase, and the boat gets easier to steer. So you really want to have a sense of how your boat's going to behave in that situation. Do we have any questions about this section of the race? This section of the race is the coolest part. This is why we're out there. We call it the slot cars. We should call it the fun part, because that's where you're going to surf if your boat's capable of doing it. The weather's nice. It's warm. People are over their nausea. I mean, it's really the payoff, and it's what you've been investing in. Or is there, heck, you might even fish. So on this leg, and I made some notes. Oh, we got a question coming in. But I'm going to ask mine is, of the sails we've talked about, which ones should we carry as a backup?